The Georgetown Faculty Club was exactly the kind of place Ronald Reagan didn't belong, at least according to Professor William Ashford. Mahogany panels lined with first editions, portraits of scholars who'd shaped American thought, and an atmosphere so thick with intellectual superiority, you could cut it with a letter opener dot. It was October 1983. And Reagan had been invited to speak at a small gathering of professors and policymakers about education reform. The invitation itself had been controversial. Professor Ashford, head of political science and a man who'd written 7 books on the failures of conservative ideology, had opposed it vehemently. "The man is an actor," Ashford had told the faculty board. "He reads lines, he doesn't understand them." But the university president had insisted. Having the sitting president speak, regardless of politics, was an honor they couldn't refuse. Now, as Reagan entered the room in his characteristic Navy suit, Ashford sat in the front row like a prosecutor ready for cross-examination. He'd spent weeks preparing, reading every speech Reagan had given, looking for intellectual weaknesses to expose. This would be his moment, dismantling the great communicator in front of his peers, proving that charm was no substitute for scholarship. Reagan began his remarks simply, talking about the value of education, the need for excellence in schools. Standard stuff, Ashford thought. Platitudes dressed up as policy. He waited, fingers drumming on his knee, for the question period. When it came, Ashford was first to raise his hand. "Mr. President," he began, his voice carrying the kind of condescension that only decades in academia can perfect. "You speak eloquently about education. But isn't it true that you yourself barely graduated from Eureka College with a C average? That you studied economics but can't explain basic Keynesian theory? That your understanding of history comes from movie scripts rather than scholarship?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several professors shifted uncomfortably. The university president looked like he might faint. Secret Service agents tensed, though this attack used words, not weapons. Ashford wasn't finished. He stood now, all 6'3" of intellectual arrogance, his Harvard Ph.D. practically glowing like a halo. "Sir, with all due respect, and I mean that term loosely, you are fundamentally uneducated for the office you hold. You're an actor playing a role you don't understand, reading speeches written by others about concepts beyond your grasp. How can you presume to lead education reform when you yourself lack the intellectual foundation to comprehend what education truly means?" The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere, a clock ticked. Someone's coffee cup rattled against a saucer. All eyes turned to Reagan, waiting for the flash of anger, the defensive retort, the wounded pride. But Reagan simply smiled. Not his camera smile, not his political smile, but something smaller, almost sad. He looked at Ashford for a long moment, then around the room at the assembled academics, before speaking in a voice so quiet people leaned forward to hear. "Professor Ashford," Reagan began, "you're absolutely right. I did get C's at Eureka, barely scraped by in economics. Never read Kant or Hegel or most of the books lining these walls." Ashford's eyes gleamed with triumph. He was already composing the op-ed he'd write about this moment. "But let me tell you about my education," Reagan continued. "When I was 7, I found my father passed out in the snow, drunk again. I dragged him inside, cleaned him up, put him to bed. That night I learned about human frailty and the choice we all have to judge or to love. I chose love. That was my first lesson in philosophy. When I was a lifeguard at Lowell Park, I saved 77 people from drowning. Not because I'd studied aquatic rescue techniques in a classroom, but because I learned that when someone's going under, you don't debate methodology, you jump in. That was my lesson in executive decision-making. During the Depression, I watched my mother give our last dollar to a family worse off than us. When I protested that we needed that money, she said, 'We need to be human more.' That was my lesson. In economics, that numbers matter less than people. In Hollywood, I watched talented friends destroyed by communist blacklists and others destroyed by communist ideology. I learned that extremism, whether right or left, treats people as abstractions rather than souls. That was my lesson in political science. As governor of California, I sat with parents whose children were killed by drunk drivers, with workers whose jobs vanished overnight, with students who couldn't afford textbooks despite working 2 jobs. Each story, each tear, each small triumph taught me more about governance than any textbook could. And yes, Professor, I read speeches written by others. But do you know what I do with those speeches? I take them to my desk and rewrite them. Not to sound smarter, but to make sure they sound human. Because I learned long ago that the most profound truths are usually the simplest ones. Reagan paused, took a sip of water. The room remained frozen. You mentioned Keynesian theory. I may not be able to debate its finer points, but I can tell you about Maria Gonzalez, who owns a small restaurant in Los Angeles. When we cut her taxes, she hired 2 more workers, both single mothers. That's my understanding of economics, not theories, but families eating dinner. You say I don't understand history. Maybe not the way you do. But I understand that history isn't just names and dates in books. It's my father finding sobriety in his final years. It's Japanese-American neighbors returning from internment camps with dignity intact. It's a wall in Berlin that divides families. And knowing that walls built on ideology always fall. That's the history that matters. Professor Ashford, you've spent your life in these magnificent halls, surrounded by books and ideas and other brilliant minds. That's a wonderful education, but it's not the only education. Some of us learned in pool halls and union halls and dance halls. Some of us learned from failure and loss and the grace of second chances. You call me uneducated because I can't quote Aristotle. But I can quote my mother, who taught me that everyone we meet is fighting a hard battle. You call me simple because I speak plainly. But I've learned that the deepest truths don't need fancy words. I may be the wrong kind of educated for this room, but America isn't this room. It's factory workers and farmers, immigrants and inventors, teachers and truckers, most of whom never set foot in places like this, but who possess wisdom that can't be measured by degrees. So yes, Professor, I am uneducated by your standards. I accept that. But I'm educated by life, by loss, by love, by the thousands of Americans who've shared their stories with me. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of education a president needs, not to know all the answers, but to understand all the questions, not to be the smartest person in the room, but to be the one who listens to everyone in it. I don't fault you for your contempt. You've earned the right to judge from these heights. But I'd ask you to consider that perhaps there are types of intelligence your tests don't measure, types of wisdom your books don't contain, types of education your universities don't provide. The janitor who cleans this room tonight, ask him about sacrifice. The security guard at the door, ask her about vigilance. The cook in the kitchen, ask him about creativity under pressure. They may not have your degrees, but they have their own doctorates in living. I'll leave you with something my father told me before he died. He said, "Dutch, I wasn't much of a father or a scholar, but I learned something worth knowing. The smartest people are the ones who know how much they don't know, and the kindest people are the ones who remember what it's like to be lost. I've been lost, Professor, many times. And every time, it wasn't a book that found me, it was a person. Usually someone you'd call uneducated. Someone who knew that the heart has reasons that reason cannot know. Thank you for your question. It's reminded me of who I am and who I serve. Not the people in this room, though I serve you too, but the ones who'll never enter rooms like this. The ones whose education came from life's harder schools. The ones who know that sometimes the most important things can't be taught, they have to be lived." Reagan sat down. For nearly a minute, no one moved. No one spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked like a heartbeat. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. It was Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the ancient professor emeritus of literature, who'd taught at Georgetown for 50 years. She stood on arthritic legs, tears streaming down her face. "My father was a coal miner," she said to the room. "Couldn't read, but he understood people better than any book I've studied. Thank you, Mr. President, for reminding me." Others began to stand. Not all. Ashford remained seated, his face a study in confusion and something that might have been shame. But most stood, applauding not for political agreement, but for human recognition. After the event, as Reagan was leaving, Ashford approached him in the hallway. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. Reagan shook his head. "You owe me nothing. Professor, you did what academics do, you challenged. That's valuable. Keep doing it. But maybe sometimes, challenge with curiosity instead of contempt. You might be surprised what you learn." "I still think you're wrong about most of your policies," Ashford said. "That's fine," Reagan smiled. "I might be. That's why I need people like you asking hard questions. Just remember that being smart isn't the same as being wise, and being educated isn't the same as being right." As Reagan walked away, Ashford called after him. "What you said about your father, about the smartest people knowing what they don't know." Reagan turned back. "I've published 7 books," Ashford said quietly. "But I've never admitted in any of them that I might be wrong. Maybe that's its own kind of ignorance." "Professor," Reagan said gently, "that's the beginning of real education." The story of that afternoon spread across campus, then beyond. Not the political headlines writers expected. Reagan demolishes liberal professor, or academic attacks president, but something quieter and more profound. Students discussed it in philosophy classes. Ministers quoted it in sermons. Parents told their children that there were many ways to be smart. Professor Ashford never publicly spoke of that encounter, but his students noticed changes. He started asking more questions, making fewer pronouncements. He invited guest speakers from outside academia, a master carpenter, a social worker, a reformed gang member. His final book, published years later, was titled The Limits of Knowing: What Life Teaches That Universities Cannot. In the dedication, he wrote, "To R.R., who taught me that education begins when you realize how much you need to learn." Reagan never knew about the book. By then, Alzheimer's had stolen his memories, his words, his ability to teach or even understand. But the lesson lived on, that wisdom comes in many forms, that kindness trumps brilliance, that the most profound education happens not in classrooms, but in the moments when we see each other clearly, beyond our credentials and prejudices, as fellow travelers trying to make sense of this brief, difficult, beautiful life. The Georgetown Faculty Club still stands. The portraits still gaze down from mahogany walls. But old-timers say something changed that October afternoon in 1983. The room feels less stuffy now, more open, as if someone had opened windows that had been painted shut for years, letting in not just air but possibility. The possibility that wisdom might walk in wearing any face, carrying any story, educated by any path through the deep forests of being human. And sometimes, late in the afternoon when the light slants just right through those tall windows, you can almost hear it, the sound of assumptions breaking, of minds opening, of education beginning at last. But the story didn't end in that room. The ripples from that October afternoon spread in ways no one could have predicted. 3 days later, Professor Ashford did something unprecedented in his 30-year career. He walked into his advanced political theory seminar, the one reserved for his brightest doctoral students, and began not with Machiavelli or Rousseau, but with a question. What if everything I've taught you is incomplete? His students, accustomed to Ashford's certainty, shifted uneasily. Sarah Chun, his star pupil who'd already published 2 papers, raised her hand. "Professor, are you feeling all right?" Ashford laughed. a sound his students had rarely heard. I met someone this week who suggested that perhaps there are forms of intelligence our tests don't measure. I dismissed him at first, but I haven't slept well since. So today, instead of discussing Hobbes, I want to hear about your education, not your formal education, but the lessons that shaped you before you ever entered a classroom. The silence was profound. These were students who'd spent their lives being rewarded for academic excellence, trained to cite sources and construct arguments. Personal experience had no place in scholarly discourse. Finally, Marcus Williams, a quiet student from Detroit, raised his hand. My grandmother couldn't read, Professor, but she could look at a person and know if they were lying. She said people tell truth with their bodies, not their words. She was never wrong. That's not education, another student protested. That's just intuition, is it? Ashford asked. Or is it a different kind of literacy? The floodgates opened. Students shared stories they'd never thought relevant to their studies. Maria spoke of her mother, who fled El Salvador with nothing but could stretch a dollar further than any economist. James talked about his father, a mechanic who understood systems thinking better than any theorist, because he could hear what was wrong with an engine. By the end of class, Ashford had filled 3 whiteboards, not with theories, but with types of intelligence academia ignored: emotional literacy, practical wisdom, cultural knowledge, survival skills, spiritual insight. Your assignment, he said as class ended, is to interview someone without formal education and write about what they know that we don't teach here. And for the first time in my career, I'll be doing the assignment too. Ashford chose Charlie Washington, the janitor who'd cleaned his office for 15 years. They'd exchanged pleasantries, but never really talked. Now over coffee in the campus cafe, another first, as Ashford had never been seen socializing with staff. He listened as Charlie explained his philosophy of work. Every room tells a story, Charlie said. Your office? Books everywhere, but the important ones are worn. Coffee stains by the chair that faces away from the desk. That's where you really think. 3 pictures of your daughter, but they're all from when she was young. You're holding on to something. Ashford was stunned. In 15 minutes, Charlie had read his life more accurately than his therapist had in 2 years. How do you know all this? Charlie smiled. Same way you know what you know, Professor. I pay attention. Just to different things. Meanwhile, the story of Reagan's response had reached a young reporter named David Brooks, who was working on a piece about anti-intellectualism in American politics. He'd planned to use the Georgetown incident as an example of Reagan's folksiness playing to the base. But when he interviewed attendees, he heard something different. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the professor who'd first stood to applaud, invited Brooks to her office. At 91, she was Georgetown's oldest active faculty member. Young man, she said, I've spent 70 years in academia. I've known brilliant people who were fools and simple people who were sages. What Reagan did that day wasn't anti-intellectual. It was multi-intellectual. He expanded the definition of what it means to know. She pulled out a faded photograph, a young woman in doctoral robes standing next to a man in mining clothes. My father, the day I got my PhD from Harvard. He cried through the whole ceremony. Afterwards, I asked him if he was proud. He said, Lizzie, I'm proud you got there kind of smart. Just don't forget you already had our kind. Brooks's article, when it appeared in The Atlantic, wasn't what his editors expected. Instead of partisan analysis, he'd written a meditation on multiple intelligences, on the democracy of wisdom, on what America loses when it valorizes only one kind of knowing. The piece went viral before viral was a term. Teachers read it too. Their classes, ministers preached on it. Corporate trainers used it to discuss different leadership styles. It sparked a national conversation about education, wisdom, and the varieties of human intelligence. At the White House, Reagan received a letter that moved him deeply. It was from William Ashford. Mr. President, I've been thinking about our encounter for weeks now. You asked me to challenge with curiosity instead of contempt. I'm trying, but it's harder than I imagined. Contempt is armor. Curiosity requires vulnerability. I've started a new project, interviewing people whose intelligence intimidates me precisely because I can't measure it. My janitor, who reads rooms like I read books. A taxi driver who navigates human nature as skillfully as city streets. My mother, who I realized I've never asked about her wisdom because she only finished high school. You said the beginning of real education is admitting what we don't know. If that's true, then at 52, with 7 books and countless papers to my name, I'm just starting kindergarten. I still disagree with many of your policies. But I'm learning to disagree differently, to wonder what experiences shape your views that I might not understand. To ask not, how can he think that? But what has he seen that I haven't? Thank you for a lesson I didn't know I needed. With respect, and I mean that term genuinely now. William Ashford, Reagan wrote back personally, in his own hand. Dear Professor, your letter reminds me that we're all teachers and students, often in the same moment. I learned from you too that day that courage isn't just physical, it's also intellectual. It takes guts to challenge a president in a room full of your peers. Keep asking hard questions. But yes, maybe sometimes ask them the way a child does, not to prove others wrong, but to understand why they might be right. Your newest student, Ronald Reagan P.S. Ask your mother about raising you. I bet that's a doctoral dissertation in itself. Ashford did ask his mother. The conversation lasted 6 hours and changed his relationship with her forever. She told him about keeping the family together after his father left, about choosing which bills to pay each month, about helping him with homework she didn't understand by teaching him to find people who did. I always felt stupid around your professor friends, she admitted. Mom, Ashford said, tears in his eyes, you're the smartest person I know. I just learned the wrong definition of smart. The Georgetown Faculty Club incident became a case study, but not in political science, in education reform. Schools began recognizing multiple intelligences. Businesses started valuing emotional and practical intelligence alongside academic credentials. The phrase educated by life lost its defensive edge and became a simple description of a different, but equal path to wisdom. Reagan referenced the moment only once more publicly, in his farewell address in 1989. I've had many titles: actor, governor, president. But I'm proudest of being called a student. Because that's what America made me, a student of its people, their dreams, their wisdom. From professors to plumbers, from scientists to secretaries, everyone had something to teach. The key was learning to listen with humility. After Reagan's Alzheimer's diagnosis became public, Professor Ashford wrote an op-ed that surprised everyone who knew his earlier work. I once called Ronald Reagan uneducated. I was educated then, but not wise. Now, as I watch this man face his diagnosis with grace, I'm reminded of what he taught me, that the deepest education comes, not from what we know, but from how we face what we don't understand. Reagan is losing his words, but his lesson remains. There are many ways to be intelligent, many ways to matter, many ways to teach even in silence. When Reagan died in 2004, Professor Ashford attended the funeral. He stood in line for hours to pay his respects. When he reached Nancy Reagan, she recognized him. "You're the professor from Georgetown," she said. "Ronnie kept your letter." Sighed. It was one of the most meaningful he received as president. "He changed how I teach, how I think, how I see," Ashford said simply. "I came to thank him." "He's still teaching," Nancy said, glancing at the flag-draped casket. "Even now." Today, in Professor Ashford's old office at Georgetown, he retired. In 2010, hangs a framed quote. Not from Aristotle or Kant, but from a janitor named Charlie Washington. "Every room tells a story. Every person is a library. The question is, Are you willing to read? Below it, in Ashford's handwriting, real education begins when you realize everyone has something to teach you. The faculty club still hosts distinguished speakers. But now, alongside Nobel laureates and Supreme Court justices, they invite artists and athletes, craftspeople and caregivers. The requirement isn't credentials, but wisdom, wherever it was earned. And sometimes, when the light is right and the room is quiet. Old-timers say you can feel it, the ghost of that October afternoon when a president some called uneducated taught a room full of professors that the greatest ignorance is thinking you have nothing left to learn. The lesson endures. Education isn't what you know. It's knowing that everyone you meet knows something you don't. Wisdom isn't having all the answers. It's asking better questions. And sometimes, the most profound teaching happens when someone has the courage to say, "You're right. I don't know. Tell me your story." In the end, Reagan's calm reply that silenced a room didn't just change one professor or one university. It reminded America that democracy of wisdom is as important as democracy of votes, that every citizen carries knowledge worth sharing, that every life is an education worth studying, that every person we dismiss as uneducated might be the teacher we need most. The room fell silent that day, not from embarrassment or shock, but from recognition, the sudden, humbling awareness that they'd been in the presence of a different kind of professor, one whose classroom was life itself, and whose lesson plan was written in scars and stars, failures and forgiveness, simple words that carried complex truths. And the education continues.